Oral questions by members.
Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. Well, yesterday, once again, as we have been for months, we raised serious concerns about the risk of cruise ships permanently bypassing our ports. The Premier was, as he has been from the very start, he was dismissive about the issue. Let's be clear, the consequences will be devastating for British Columbia. We know that it will threaten thousands of jobs and impact billions of dollars to our economy. But here was the Premier's response, and I quote, "The governor from Utah may have trouble with a 100-year-old bill in his jurisdiction. Fair enough, change it. That's what you should do," end quote. That quote and the Premier's continued responses show how completely out of touch he is on this file. Can the Premier explain to British Columbians what on earth he was talking about yesterday and explain why he has been completely missing in action on this file from day one?
Minister of Tourism. Transportation. Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Leader of the Opposition for the question. Well, yesterday was a very important day for all British Columbians and a welcome day when Dr. Bonnie Henry, the Premier, the Minister of Health, the Minister of Tourism and Jobs and Economic Recovery announced Stage 2, announced a further reopening of our economy, a reduction of health restrictions in terms of our social and economic activities, the ability to have outdoor gatherings of up to 50 people, more in-person services being possible, some spectator events and activities being resumed. And what Dr. Henry outlined yesterday was that we're on track over the next incubation period to announce a further reduction in health restrictions when we reach Stage 3 on July 1st. This is fantastic news. This is a tribute to everybody who has worked so hard to keep British Columbians safe. It's a tribute to the job that public health has done leading this province to a place of COVID safety and the restoration of economic activity and as much normalcy as possible under the pandemic circumstances. We will also proceed to Stage 4 based on how we perform this summer for further reductions still. So what the announcement today did for British Columbians was aligned perfectly with what the Premier has called for publicly. He has called for the Prime Minister to take the opportunity on June 21st, when the United States and the Prime Minister's office representing Canada announce what our approach will be on opening the border.
Thank you.
The Premier has been clear that if you're dealing with the land border, you have to deal with airports and you have to deal with ports. We are in a far better position today than we were just 3 weeks ago when we were still in a COVID circuit breaker situation, when we had hundreds and hundreds of new cases per day. The vaccination rates are continuing to proceed on pace in our country. Now is the time for the Prime Minister to lead the discussion on what reopening the border looks like for the U.S., including for the cruise industry here in British Columbia.
Leader of the Official Opposition, supplemental.
Well, thank you very much. And what's painfully obvious is that this Premier has been completely missing in action on a file that is critical to British Columbians. It is absolutely unbelievable that this minister completely ignores the essence of this question. His Premier called the situation with cruise ships potentially bypassing British Columbia a blip. And the minister might want to reflect back 3 weeks ago. Well, if this Premier had been doing his job from months ago, we would not be in the position we're in today. It is time for him to stand up and admit that he has made a complete mess of this file. He was wrong then, and he is wrong now. Let's look at the words, the now famous words of the tourism minister, and I would quote her words, and they will be quoted for a long time, I am positive. This government is, and I quote, arrogant in their confidence. And yesterday, that was on display in this House. Over and over, we have heard the statistics, and the members opposite know exactly what they are. Thousands of jobs are at risk. Billions of dollars are at risk. And what did the Premier call it? A blip. And yesterday, what did we hear the leader of British Columbia say? Here's what he said, and I quote, "Fair enough. Change it. That's what you should do," end quote. Well, not only has the Premier completely botched this file, now we need to ask an even more basic question. On whose side is he? When will he finally stand up for the men and women who will be impacted if this decision becomes permanent? That's his job. He is missing in action. It is time for him to get up and fix the mess.
Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And again, to the Minister, to the Leader of the Official Opposition. What the Premier has done is speak to his counterparts. The Governor of Washington, representing the Port of Seattle, has talked to legislators in Alaska. Most importantly, has talked to his fellow premiers in this country, right across all provinces and territories, about the federally decided position on the border closure. We're now just being able to glimpse what normalcy might look like. We are just now able to talk in a tangible, realistic way about how Canadians might safely visit their loved ones and relations in the United States and vice versa for Americans to come to Canada. That's the light at the end of the tunnel today after a 15-month-long struggle, one that was very difficult on the cruise ship industry in particular, it must be said. We know how they in particular struggled at the beginning of this pandemic, tied up in ports around the world, active sites of some of the worst COVID transmission outbreaks that the world knew. And now we have just on May 6th, a set of guidelines that have been developed by the US Center for Disease Control. They're conducting trial cruises. The Prime Minister, when he announced earlier this year in February that ports would be closed for an additional year, was an entirely different time. And we forget, because time seems very compressed during this pandemic, what things were like just a few short moments ago. But at that time, many provinces were losing the battle against COVID. It was infecting more and more Canadians, mortality in seniors' homes, disruption of businesses, disruption of schools. British Columbia did better than most, and we're proud of that. But the discussion in February of 2021 was not about opening up the border willy-nilly in Canada between the United States. That's a real discussion today.
Thanks,
because
Minister.
today the case counts are down. Today, the Prime Minister is meeting with his G7 counterparts, including President Biden, about reopening the border. I expect that the Prime Minister will revisit the port closure order that he brought in 4 months ago. I expect that will happen. And certainly British Columbia and this Premier has had opportunities and have taken
Minister.
them.
I don't think this is the only question going to be
that
asked.
the border should be opened in an orderly process.
Member for Abbotsford West.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. We first became aware of this issue back in the end of October of last year. In February, the Americans, the state delegation from Alaska, wrote to the Canadian government, wrote to the British Columbia government. We raised the issue directly in this House in March. The government was dismissive. The Premier was dismissive. The Minister of Tourism was dismissive. By April, we were in regular correspondence with the government, alerting them to the risk that the cruise industry was articulating. And yesterday we found out, in response to questions from the member for Vancouver-Langara, that the Minister of Tourism didn't actually get around to writing to federal officials on the whole question of technical stops that could have provided a solution and eliminated the need for legislative amendments in the U.S. He apparently didn't get around to writing to his federal counterparts until the end of May. Mr. Speaker, How on earth are British Columbians who are desperate to see a return of international tourists whose livelihood depends on the return of tourism, how are they supposed to have any confidence in this Premier and this government when it takes 4 months, Mr. Speaker, to write a letter exploring a solution that could have precluded the need for amendments to American legislation? That's not leadership, Mr. Speaker. Will the minister explain to British Columbians why it took him 4 months to get down to business and write the letter that should have been written back in February?
Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And to the member, we've taken a whole of government approach since day one. IGRS has been in communication with the Prime Minister's office. The Minister of Tourism has met with stakeholders and her counterparts. I've met with my counterpart in Ottawa, both the current Minister of Transportation and his predecessor, about border issues, about ports, about the cruise industry for many months. And I know the opposition likes to mischaracterize the industry, and I think that's very dangerous. They should not be talking down the industry or COVID safety or criticizing a science-led approach to what has led us to a successful position today where we're having an active border reopening discussion led by the Prime Minister, because it is his jurisdiction, with the United States, a comprehensive border reopening announcement that we expect on June 21st. But listen, the CEO of the Victoria Port Authority has written the Prime Minister on June 11th and reminded him that his port and the industry originally supported the extension in February of 2021, the closure of our ports to February 2022, but suggests to the Prime Minister, in light of vaccine rates, in light of COVID safety increasing, in light of the US CDC developing safe sailing protocols in May of this year, last month, that the government should reconsider whether ports need to be closed to February of 2022. That is exactly the position that I have expressed to my federal counterparts. That's the position of the province of British Columbia. There is opportunity, thanks to the Herculean efforts of British Columbians to stay safe, to have an all-of-Canada approach that reopens our ports, our land borders, and our airports in accordance with strict scientific policies that will keep people safe.
Thank you. Member for Abbotsford West, supplemental.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. The Americans rode in February. And this government, this Premier, this minister did nothing. Worse than doing nothing, they belittled the very people who were in the US, who were in a position to change laws that will have a profoundly permanent impact on tourism in British Columbia. And the belittling and the dismissing and the insulting continues from the Premier of British Columbia. We saw evidence of it again yesterday, Mr. Speaker. Belittling the junior senator, who's not the junior senator, by the way, is wrong, as he has been every step of the way through this saga. Every step of the way through this saga. Carnival, Holland America, Princess, Celebrity, Royal Caribbean, Norwegian, Carnival Miracle, Majestic Princess, New Amsterdam, Serenade of the Sea, Ovation of the Sea, Celebrity Summit, Norwegian Bliss. What do all those names have in common, Mr. Speaker? They're all ships that next month are going to begin sailing to Alaska, right past British Columbia ports like Victoria, Vancouver, Campbell River, Prince Rupert, and they won't be stopping there. And what's worse, because of this minister's inaction, this Premier's inaction, this government's inaction, there's a chance, a very good chance, that in the future they won't be stopping either, Mr. Speaker. And I can't believe that even today, after everything that has taken place, there are still people on that side of the House dismissing that as not a possibility. Will the minister, on behalf of the government, explain, in the face of a challenge that has materialized, that is real, that the Americans intend to pursue, why it took him 4 months to write a letter to the federal authorities articulating and advocating on behalf of British Columbia for a solution that could have made all of this go away.
Minister of Transportation.
A very interesting bit of historical revisionism from the member opposite. In February of 2021, only 2.3% of Canadians were vaccinated. 0.1% of Canadians were fully vaccinated. We were in dangerous winter conditions that enhanced the spread of COVID, people indoors, harsh restrictions, some provinces, not ours, but some provinces in full and complete lockdown. What was preoccupying the minds of the country and Canadians in general was not a hypothetical cruise ship reopening in July. It was about how we were going to get towards a safer future in our country, how we were going to get more vaccine into this country, how we were going to keep one another safe, how we were going to support each other, how we were going to roll out programs to keep businesses, communities, and workers whole. So for the opposition to say that was their preoccupation, but it gets worse, Mr. Speaker, in terms of how erratic this opposition has been. In the middle of the circuit breaker, a measure that was absolutely necessary in March of this year, just a couple of months ago, when case counts were about 1,150 on a rolling 7-day average and projected by our provincial health officials to go as high as 3,000 if we didn't take additional steps. In the middle of that circuit breaker, the member for Kamloops North Thompson was saying an entirely different thing about border. He was saying we should have a hard border enforced on Alberta. They weren't talking about reopening of borders with the United States, Mr. Speaker. They were talking about taking steps that no province even has the constitutional authority to do. Instead,
Minister.
We brought in a ban on non-essential travel. We brought restrictions that kept people safe.
Members,
and we started to see the
members
case counts
come to
go
order,
down,
please.
go
Minister,
down.
thank you.
And we came out of that circuit breaker lockdown in 2 weeks ago, Mr. Speaker. That's what letting scientists lead on COVID policy-making decisions look like. That's what's kept British Columbia safe.
Thank you, Minister. Member for Saanich North and Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last Thursday, Squamish Nation clearly gave notice to the province that they want old-growth logging in their territory deferred. Squamish Nation spokesperson Joselam said, quote, "The government is infringing on our rights by allowing these sites to be logged without our permission and without our consent," end quote. In his response last week to the Huayet, Dididat, and Pachidat request for deferrals, the Premier said, quote, "The first step in protecting old growth must be respecting Indigenous peoples' land management rights in their territories," end quote. The Minister of Forests was also eager. She said, quote, "True reconciliation means meaningful partnerships, listening to Indigenous peoples and trusting their stewardship of their territories. This is a step in the right direction, but we know there's more work to do," end quote. If the Premier and this Minister are sincere in their promises to respect land management rights of Indigenous peoples in their territories, we will see an immediate positive response to Squamish Nation's assertion of their rights. Mr. Speaker, simple question to the Minister of Forests. Has she accepted Squamish Nation's request for deferrals on old-growth harvesting in their territory?
Minister of Forest.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. And our government has received several requests from First Nations to implement deferrals, and we've responded to all incoming requests and are committed to working with them. And we have been working with the Squamish Nation since last fall and have deferred some areas in their territory as we speak. Thank you.
Member for Saanich North and Islands, supplemental.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I think Squamish Nation is being clear, and I'll be clear. They don't want talks about protecting bits and pieces, small areas here and there. The nation is calling for an immediate 2-year deferral in its entire territory. They've identified at least 20 cut blocks with old-growth logging planned for the next 5 years, a point the minister does not want to talk about. The minister said recently, quote, "The first step is putting Indigenous peoples at the center of land management in their respective territories." That's a dramatic difference than the response that we just heard, which is just more rhetoric. The Premier said a precedent in his riding. Finally, after more than 100 years, Indigenous nations have a pathway to stewarding and conserving their lands and can negotiate better economic terms than the pittance that this government has ever offered them. It's an exciting time, Mr. Speaker. For decades, this province has been operating a cut-and-run forestry policy. And now the decisions can be made by people who live on and care for the land. My question again is to the minister. The minister and premier have said they are embracing a new era of Indigenous people making decisions in their territories. Our relatives in Squamish have made their decision. They've been clear about what that decision is to this government. Will the minister do the honourable thing and immediately grant a full set of deferrals, pausing old-growth harvesting in the Squamish Nation territory?
Minister of Forest.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And committed to reconciliation and environmental protection, which we believe must go together. And the member's right. The days of making unilateral decisions.
Minister, we lost the audio.
Do you want me to start over, Mr. Speaker?
Yes, please.
Okay, thank you. And I thank the member. And our government is committed to reconciliation and environmental protection, which we believe must go together. The days of making unilateral decisions without Indigenous peoples are over. The member is quite accurate. And we've been clear that the first step to protecting old growth is putting Indigenous people at the center of land management in their territories. And that's exactly why our government is working with the Pachidat, the Dididat, and the Hawaiiat First Nations to defer old growth logging in their territories, discussions that have been ongoing for a while. And as you know, the member has said that, you know, we are reaching out to nations. We have responded to nations that have asked for deferrals. We are having those important confidential government-to-government discussions, and we will continue to do that with nations across the province who are looking to have more access to the land management in their traditional territory, to be able to have a say in how their land is managed. It's critically important to this government. We are moving forwards. We will have more deferrals to announce this summer.
Member for Kelowna Mission.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, we've heard a flood of stories of people who have had to wait unbearably long hours for an ambulance. The government says it doesn't happen that often, but to the people who are waiting in excruciating pain, it's happening far too often. Troy Clifford, the head of the Paramedics Union in BC, says the delays and waits are becoming the norm. And I quote, "We need to modernize the service delivery model, recognize this profession is vital to public safety and healthcare, and recognize the professionals doing the work and treat them similar to other healthcare professionals," end quote. Seniors shouldn't have to wait hours in their own waste. Accident victims shouldn't have to drive themselves to the hospital after waiting 5 hours. And no one wants to hear that the Premier wants to deflect blame. Can the Premier tell British Columbians what he's going to do to fix this crisis in our healthcare system?
Minister of Health.
Well, thank you very much. And what we've done since 2017 to address the situation amongst ambulance paramedics, I think, should be well known to the member. We've more than doubled the increases the ambulance service gets every year compared to the 4 years prior to my becoming Minister of Health and the Premier becoming Premier. We've added, since last fall, 263 positions, and as of July 2nd, 434 additional positions will be posted based on a plan that we worked together with the union, with QP Local 873, the ambulance paramedics of BC, on a contract we negotiated together. Of course, every time someone calls 911, we need them to get the service they deserve, and every time there's a problem with that, it's a subject of concern for every ambulance paramedic and for the BC Emergency Health Services. And that's why we put together an unprecedented investment. We've added an unprecedented number of ambulance paramedics. And yes, we've treated ambulance paramedics with respect rather than taking away their right at the bargaining table. We've added to those rights since 2017, treating them as other healthcare workers are treated, with respect and with dignity.
Member for Kelowna Mission, supplemental.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, despite the minister's urging that more money is being spent, more money is not the answer for mismanagement. Troy Clifford has been clear that mismanagement has been leading to these delays becoming the norm. And I quote, "They have an obligation to staff ambulances and put 2 paramedics in them to make sure we have enough dispatchers to answer the call, to make sure that we can provide medical assistance while they wait for the ambulances." That's not happening right now. It hasn't been happening for a while, end quote. In my area of the province, the problem of vacant cars, it's posing a serious challenge. And this includes no advanced life support for the Okanagan 2 nights a week for a few months now. In other regions, stations like Kimberley and Pemberton are being downgraded to part-time and on-call despite increases in population and calls. This is putting people's lives at risk. So again, to the Premier, when will he move to fix this crisis before someone pays a heavy price with their life?
Minister of Health.
Well, Speaker, since the pandemic began, we've added 55 ambulances across BC, particularly in rural and remote communities who were particularly underserved before. Since the pandemic began, we've added 5 new air resources to our ambulance system to improve services, again, in rural and remote communities. Since last fall, we've added 260 plus ambulance paramedics positions, and we are posting more than 400 on July the 2nd. We've done this because of the priority we give to the ambulance service everywhere in BC, moving to more full-time paramedics, hundreds of new positions, and all of the efforts we're making are necessary because we do have to modernize the ambulance service into the 21st century. Some of that work, it should be said, occurred under the previous government, particularly the actions of George Abbott when he was Minister of Health in adding community paramedicine, which stabilized the ambulance services in rural and remote communities. And we have built on that work, the best that was done, but also added resources that were never put in place to ensure that rural BC gets the ambulance service it deserves, and that we add ambulance paramedics everywhere in BC. The member wants a plan. There is a plan. That's why we're adding hundreds of positions.
Member for Cariboo North.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Quesnel is one of 5 rural remote stations that is being deeply impacted by this transition that happened in April under this new model that this minister has been talking about, which is now leaving us with a single ambulance. Quesnel receives 1,300 calls per year, and the reality is that the second car is no longer staffed. And that means the local station is serving a population of 35,000 people with 1 car. Further, this station covers a very large geographic area. It can take hours to get to 1 call in Nasco. And what happens if there's an accident on Highway 97 near Macleese Lake, many hours away? Or what happens if someone is under cardiac arrest in Quesnel, where the timing is the difference between life and death? Mr. Speaker, people are worried now. They're worried about what happens when they call for an ambulance and there just simply isn't one because we don't have the staffing. Again, in Quesnel, they could get 12 calls in 6-hour period and they cannot possibly meet all the requests. And what happens when staffing becomes even more challenging in July and August? So please, will the Premier step up, do the right thing, and fix this crisis so the people in Quesnel have proper ambulance care?
Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Honourable Speaker, and thank you to the member for her question. As the member will know, 55 new ambulances in rural and remote communities, significant addition in full-time paramedics in the Cariboo since 2017, additions to community paramedicine. The focus on improving service in rural BC as we do transition to a model of more full-time people, which is exactly what rural BC deserves, Honourable Speaker, that the old model of ambulance service didn't work adequately for the people of rural BC in the modern reality of rural BC. And that's why these very significant investments, the most significant investments ever made in paramedic services in rural BC have been made in the last 3 years. It's what I think MLAs across rural BC had been calling for a long time, and it is what we intend to continue to deliver. These were added to when the Premier announced on April 20th, 2020, additional resources and services for rural and remote communities at the time of COVID. This priority is real, and we continue to add spaces and add services, including in the Cariboo, Honourable Speaker, in order to ensure that we give people the service they deserve. It is a challenge in a very big province to provide such services, but BC Emergency Health Services has been given the resources and been given the direction to deliver those services across rural BC, and I think the significant investment over the last 3 years is a demonstration of that.
The bell ends the question period.